Today we're going to look at the communication cycle and the different components that make it up. So to start this, we'll begin with the first stage, which is the sender. So the first stage is the individual that has information to send. So you have an idea or you have some information and you need to decide what to do with it. Generally, there are two options here: do nothing or act. If you decide to act, make sure that you are clear about what you want to communicate and why, and that the information that you're going to give is useful and accurate. So there's three things you can check in here just to make sure. So the first one is what you're saying relevant today, or is it really yesterday's message? The second point, is it necessary? Or is it just a bee in my bonnet? Should I really wait and see whether this is as important later? And the third point, what information do I need to send and what am I trying to achieve with it? So on to stage 2, which is the compose encode stage, so technically defining the message. When creating your message, make sure that the information is in language that both the sender and the person that you are sending it to can understand. So there's a few things to think about here. Think about the type and the level of language that you're going to use. So perhaps if you're a technical person, will the recipient understand that? So just think about that as well. Have you included any jargon or abbreviations which might be misinterpreted or confusing? Always suggest you do a spell check and make sure you proofread any information. A spell check will only take you so far. Think about the audience as well, so not just including people for the sake of it, and making sure you're not missing off any key people for who this information may be useful. Make sure your message is clear about what you want your audience to do with the information. And also keep it relevant and succinct. So make sure you've got sufficient information for them to be able to act, and not too much detail. There can be a tendency to overshare and share everything. Is it really necessary? The next point would be, does the audience have any prior knowledge of this topic, and do they need that? Do you need to give a little bit of context around the message that you're sending on? And last but not least, and very important, are you expressing emotions? So perhaps if it's a topic you feel emotional about, maybe get someone else to have a little check. Remember, the quality of the message is always your responsibility. So whatever method you choose to send it in, you could consider testing any important messages on a small scale first, just to allow you to refine that if needs be. Stage 3 is transmit, so essentially sending the message. There are many methods of communicating information, so your job here is to make sure that you choose the right one for the purpose and not just the one that you prefer. So for example, my husband here is a great example. He doesn't like using the phone, so he will always revert to email, whereas sometimes if it's something that needs an answer quickly, the telephone is much better. So think about that. Think about which method will be most effective for getting the response that you want. Think about the timings. Is it the right time to send the message? So are there any other things going on that you need to think about in terms of workload or people's mindset? Are there any distractions that could impact the communication? So I think COVID is a great example of that at the moment, where that may have got in the way. Moving on to stage 4, this is where the receiver actually gets the information. So they notice or they hear or see the message. So having sent that message, all being well, they notice it. However, there can be a number of reasons that might prevent your message from getting through. So just recapping on what we've already talked about here, it's your responsibility as the sender to check this is received and understood. And we'll move on to the next couple of stages which might help you with that. So looking at stage 5, which is decode, this is where the recipient processes the message. So decoding can be defined really as interpreting that message and coming to an understanding about what is being communicated to them. A practical example here would be perhaps when you're watching a TV advertisement and you come to an understanding about what the product is. That might involve you paraphrasing or managing it in a certain way so that you understand the information. It can also be one area where things are misinterpreted. So going back to the TV advert again, you may be able to think about times where you've watched an advert and you get to the end of it and is it really clear what product that advert is representing? It's not always. So that would be an example of where it's been decoded and it doesn't really relate. So again, responsibility there back to the sender for making sure that that can be as clear as possible. So moving on to stage 6, feedback. I would always recommend that you include some form of feedback as part of your communication, because this will make you able to check that there's been no misunderstandings and that people have understood the whole message and not just part of it. So the feedback stage really is about reviewing those outcomes and feedback and then taking any action that you might need to take as a result of that. So there's a few things to think about here. How will you check that your message has been understood? How will you gain feedback? Think about, did the recipients respond the way that you expected them to? What could you have done differently if they didn't to get the response that you wanted? How could you change your message or behaviour for greater impact? And if your communication is verbal, can you use any visual clues, such as the audience responses or body language? How would you use those signals? Is there any indirect feedback, anything more that you can interpret from responses that you're having, or lack of even? That can sometimes tell you, can be a rich source of information. And then maybe identify some resources to help you to improve. So maybe asking colleagues or surveys or additional resources to help you to improve if it's formal presentation skills, for example. If your message isn't received successfully for whatever reason, you might want to go back, review it and try it again. So treat it as a golden opportunity to improve your skills and adding that feedback to any inputs. All the feedback in the world, of course, won't help you unless you commit to learning and actually making a change. So there we have it. That's the communication cycle as it stands. In summary, really a few things to say is that good communicators use plain and direct language, but also adapt the message to their audience. So it's vital to remember that good communication is a two-way process. It has to be credible to be effective, so you must do whatever you say you're going to do. If you break a promise, people will make you work twice as hard in the future before they'll believe you again. If you keep in touch with your team informally on a day-to-day basis, you'll be amazed at how much vital information you can pick up, how many problems you can preempt, and how much better your people will feel. So taking into account the steps above, you could consider developing yourself a checklist before communicating to verify your intended message. Words are inherently ambiguous and no one gets their message across clearly and sensitively all the time. However, being aware of the pitfalls and bearing some common sense guidelines in mind should help you to keep misunderstandings to a minimum. Hopefully that's been useful, so take some time now just to have a think about any things that you need to write down in your action plan for next time, and use the communication cycle as a guide.